They didn't just knock down a shack, they bulldozed the one place that stitched my family back together. At sunrise, I stood in a cloud of cedar dust where my cabin at Ironwood Lake used to breathe and watched Brenda Malloy, queen of clipboards, grin like she'd mounted my porch on her trophy wall. The HOA said I was delinquent, waived a mystery dredging fee, and called demolition remediation. But I've spent a lifetime tracing bad wires through bigger disasters than Karen politics. When the smoke cleared, I found something they never expected: a dotted line on an old plat map and a loophole big enough to sail a barge through. If Brenda thinks a forged invoice and a borrowed crown can bury me, she's about to learn what happens when a quiet man fights with paperwork sharper than any bulldozer blade. I didn't lose a cabin. I found the fuse. Before we dive in, drop where you're watching from and your local time below. The morning after my cabin was reduced to rubble, I stood at the edge of Ironwood Lake and tried to swallow the truth. My sanctuary, the place where my daughter learned to cast a fishing line and where I relearned how to breathe after 20 years of service had been erased overnight. In its place was a scar in the earth, fresh tire tracks from the bulldozer still pressed into the mud. The air reeked of diesel and splintered cedar, and Brenda Malloy, the HOA president, everyone quietly called the Red Queen, had marched off with her clipboard tucked under her arm like a sword she'd just bloodied. I wasn't new to loss. I'd buried comrades, stood in front of folded flags, and watched good men vanish under the weight of bad decisions. But this was different. This was my ground, my family's ground. My father's initials were carved into the porch railing they split in two. My late wife's photo frame lay cracked in the dirt, and Brenda thought she could call it remediation because of a phantom $3 0 inches special assessments. I didn't raise my voice when she came marching the day before, tapping her French manicured nail against a clipboard full of lies. She spoke of newsletters, emergency dredging, and bylaw authority as if those words made her the sheriff of the lake. I simply told her, "You can't do this." But she smirked and said, "Oh, but we can. Pay by 5 p.m. or watch your shack come down." She didn't even bother to call it a home, just a shack. Now the shack was gone, and I was left with the silence. Neighbors passed by the wreckage that morning like they were driving past a car crash, eyes forward, hands tight on the wheel. One or two offered hushed condolences. Old Mr. Dugan, my nearest neighbor, wrung his cap in his hands and whispered, "Sorry, Ethan, she's gone too far." But he shuffled back to his porch without looking me in the eye. Fear was already setting in. Fear of Brenda, fear of the board, fear of being next. I wanted to storm into the HOA office with my stack of canceled checks, slam them on Brenda's desk, and shout until someone listened. But the office door was locked. Blinds drawn, a handwritten sign taped to the glass, closed for training. Training. That was the punchline. They'd already decided my fate, and they didn't want witnesses. I drove back to the ruin and sat on the tailgate of my truck, staring at the splintered boards, like they might arrange themselves back into the cabin if I waited long enough. But the longer I stared, the more I felt something shift inside me. The rage didn't burn hot. It froze cold, hard, and clear. This wasn't the end. This was the opening shot of a war I hadn't chosen but would damn well finish. I started by combing through every record I had at home. My father taught me to keep ledgers, every receipt and every canceled check filed neatly. My file cabinets groaned under the weight of years of proof. Not one notice of a special assessment. Not one line item for dredging. They fabricated it. And they thought I'd roll over, let them cart away my life because I was just one man. But I wasn't just one man. I was a veteran who had been trained to fight battles with patience, with precision, and with evidence. And I wasn't about to let a suburban tyrant rewrite my history. That night, I called my daughter Maya. She answered with her usual cheerful energy, talking about a patient she'd helped at the hospital, her laugh carrying through the receiver. I listened until she asked why I was quiet. My throat tightened as I told her what happened, each word like a nail in my chest, the threat, the bulldozer, the wreckage. There was a silence so heavy I thought the call had dropped. Then, a broken whisper, "No, Dad. Not the cabin. Not our place." I could hear her stifling sobs, the same girl who once sat on that porch during her illness, regaining her strength with every lungful of lake air. To her, the cabin wasn't just timber and nails. It was rebirth. And now it was gone. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart," was all I could say. That night I barely slept. I sat in the dark with a lantern, and my ledger books spread across the table, the quiet hum of crickets outside. Every so often I'd hear laughter drifting from across the water, the HOA clubhouse lit up like a victory party. Brenda wasn't mourning. She was celebrating. She thought she'd won. But power has a way of blinding people to their weakest flank. As I studied the HOA bylaws, the county maps, and the tangled mess of their newsletters, I saw cracks forming. Words like remediation and special assessment only worked if they were built on truth. And Brenda's truth was a house of cards. When dawn crept over Ironwood Lake, I walked down to the shoreline. The water lapped gently against the stones, indifferent to the wreckage behind me. But as I looked out at that expanse of silver blue, a thought lodged in my mind like a hook, catching deep. Maybe the cabin wasn't the only thing worth fighting for. Maybe the lake itself held the key. I didn't know it then, but that idea, the notion that Brenda had built her empire on borrowed water, was about to change everything. The first step in any war is reconnaissance. I knew from my time overseas that you don't charge into battle without understanding the terrain, both physical and political. Brenda might have thought she'd won when she flattened my cabin, but what she really did was draw a battle line in the dirt. And if she wanted to play by the rulebook of the HOA, I was ready to show her just how fragile her rulebook really was. 2 days after the demolition, I drove to the HOA office with my binder of records, every canceled check, every receipt, every newsletter stacked neatly in chronological order. I expected a fight, but what I didn't expect was the ambush waiting inside. The office was a cramped space with fluorescent lights that buzzed like angry hornets. Behind the front desk sat Paula Riggs, Brenda's enforcer. She had the same permanent frown carved into her face that made you wonder if she'd ever smiled in her life. She looked up as I walked in and immediately scowled. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice flat. "President Malloy anticipated you might come by." She gestured toward the corner of the room where 5 cardboard boxes sagged under the weight of loose invoices, bank statements, and scraps of paper. "Here are the financial records you requested. You have 2 hours. No copies, no photographs." It was a trap, clear as day. Most people would look at those boxes, see the mountain of disorganized paper, and give up. But to me, it was a schematic. I'd spent decades tracing faulty wires through military generators, finding the one corroded terminal that could shut down an entire system. This was no different. Chaos was just another kind of circuit, and I knew how to trace it. I rolled up my sleeves and started digging. The first box was stuffed with landscaping invoices, thousands of dollars paid out to a company called Green Horizons LLC. No address, no phone number, no contractor license number. It smelled like a shell corporation. The next box had repair bills for equipment. The HOA didn't even own an industrial pool filter, listed for a community that didn't have a pool. The deeper I went, the uglier it got. There was a $5,000 charge for pool pump maintenance from a contractor whose license had expired 3 years earlier. Another for community center HVAC upgrade. Yet the clubhouse air conditioner was older than I was and rattled like a tin can every summer. But the crown jewel was in the third box, a single invoice for $75,000 billed to the HOA by a company called Clearwater Environmental LLC. The description was vague: emergency dredging of Ironwood Lake. The date on the invoice was 4 months before my cabin was demolished. I held the paper closer to the light. The logo was pixelated as if someone had copied it from a website and slapped it on a document. There was no business license number, no tax ID, no physical address, and the signature at the bottom, some lazy looping scrawl, looked eerily familiar. I dug into another box and found a contract Brenda had signed for the installation of new mailboxes. I laid the 2 signatures side by side. My stomach clenched, but not from surprise, from certainty. The signatures were identical. Brenda hadn't just approved a fraudulent invoice, she had created it. My 2 hours were almost up, but I'd already found the ammunition I needed. I put the fake invoice in the center of the table and stared at it, memorizing every pixel, every crooked line. Proof. This was the smoking gun. But proof doesn't mean victory. When I tried to rally my neighbors with what I'd found, I ran headfirst into the wall of fear Brenda had built. I started with old Mr. Dugan, the same man who had whispered she's gone too far at the wreckage. I showed him the invoice, traced Brenda's signature, explained the fraud in plain English. His face went pale as he studied the paper. "Good God, Ethan," he whispered. "This is criminal." "Then stand with me," I urged. "At the next board meeting, we demand an audit. We can remove her. Together." But he shook his head, his hands trembling. "I can't. My pension is all I have. If she targets me, I'll lose my house. I'm sorry." He shuffled back inside the door, closing like the last page of a book I couldn't rewrite. The same story repeated at every doorstep. A young family told me Brenda had fast-tracked their variance for a backyard deck. They couldn't betray her. Another man who'd once been loud about his hatred for the HOA suddenly mumbled excuses and said he just wanted to be left alone. Brenda had spent years weaving a net of favors and threats. Those who obeyed were rewarded. Those who resisted were fined, ostracized, or worse. Fear was her real currency, and my neighbors were deep in debt. That night, as if to prove her point, the harassment campaign began. A violation notice appeared on my door, garbage can visible from street before pickup time, $50 fine. The next week, Paula showed up with her ruler measuring the height of my grass, a quarter-inch too tall, $75 fine. The week after that, I opened the HOA newsletter to find a section titled Good Neighbor Policy, a thinly veiled attack on me. It read, certain residents are spreading malicious rumors about the board's financial management. Such divisive behavior harms our property values and reflects poorly on us all. I was being painted as the enemy, the troublemaker, the man jeopardizing the community's stability, and it worked. Neighbors who once waved now turned their heads. At the grocery store, people suddenly found the cereal aisle fascinating when I walked by. I was being erased socially just as surely as Brenda had erased my cabin. At home, my daughter Maya called every night, her voice laced with worry. "Dad, maybe you should just let it go. They're not worth it." What if they target our house next? I wanted to promise her it would be fine, but the truth was I didn't know. Every day, Brenda pushed harder, making it clear this wasn't just about unpaid fees. It was about crushing me, erasing me as an example to anyone who dared defy her. But what Brenda didn't understand was that I'd lived under tyrants before. I'd seen entire cities kneel under fear. And I knew the truth about fear. It only works until someone exposes the lie holding it up. And Brenda's lie was written in pixelated ink at the bottom of that $75,000 invoice. In war, the enemy's arrogance is often their undoing. Brenda had bulldozed my cabin, paraded her authority, and thought she'd lock the gates on my future. But as I sat one sleepless night in my garage, surrounded by stacks of HOA records, my eyes drifted up to the large plat map I had tacked on the wall. It showed every lot around Ironwood Lake, each square numbered, each boundary traced in black ink. And then I saw it, something I had overlooked 100 times. The residential parcels were neatly marked as HOA jurisdiction. But the lake itself, the water, the shoreline, the very heart of the community, was outlined separately. Parcel B. Not listed as HOA property, not even referenced in their bylaws. Just a dotted line separating the homes from the water. My pulse quickened. I pulled the county deed records I had requested weeks earlier when I first bought my cabin. I flipped through brittle photocopies of documents that smelled of mildew and age. And there it was, buried in fading ink, on a 1978 survey, Parcel B, Ironwood Lake, originally held by Timberline Development Corporation. Timberline had gone bankrupt in the late 1982. Their assets were parceled out, auctioned, dissolved into a maze of shell companies. But somehow Parcel B had slipped through the cracks. It was marked as inactive, holding a bureaucratic orphan no one had claimed in over 30 years. For decades, the HOA had acted as if they owned the lake. They collected dock fees, levied lake maintenance assessments, and strutted about like landlords of a kingdom they had no legal title to. But in reality, they were squatters, self-appointed rulers, over a property they never had a deed for. I sat back in my chair and let the revelation sink in. If the HOA had no right to the lake, then their $75,000 emergency dredging invoice wasn't just fraudulent, it was theft. They had billed homeowners for work on property that wasn't theirs to touch. A smile crept across my face for the first time in weeks. The next morning I called Tom Navarro. Tom and I had served together overseas. He was the kind of man who could smell corruption from a mile away and enjoyed tearing it down piece by piece. When I explained what I'd found, he chuckled low. "So let me get this straight," he said. "The queen bee has been parading around like she owns the hive, but the honey isn't even hers." "Exactly," I replied. "She's been charging everyone for the upkeep of land she has no legal claim to." "This is beautiful," Tom said, the humor vanishing from his voice. "But finding the weakness is only step one. Exploiting it is another. You need someone who knows how to cut through red tape before Brenda catches wind." That's when he connected me with Avery Miller, a wiry real estate attorney who looked more like a college professor than a man who dismantled HOAs for sport. His office smelled of old coffee and ink. Books lined the walls, case law, and property codes stacked high like fortifications. I laid out my evidence, the plat map, the old deeds, the phony invoice. Miller adjusted his glasses, scanning each document with surgical precision. For 20 minutes he said nothing, just scribbled notes with the tip of a fountain pen. Finally he leaned back, tapped the papers, and said, "It's doable. The lake is what we call an abandoned asset. Technically, it's still on the county's books, but with no claimant. We can petition the state under abandoned property law, prove it's been neglected, and make a cash offer. Complicated, yes, but possible. How much, I asked, bracing myself. Every penny you've got, he said bluntly. And it has to be quiet. If the HOA learns what you're doing, they'll tie it up in court for years. You'll need patience, discipline, and absolute secrecy. Secrecy was something I knew well. I left Miller's office with my chest tight, not from fear, but from the weight of the decision. My wife and I had saved for years, scrimping on vacations and luxuries, setting aside money for our twilight years. Now I was about to put it all on the line for a lake. Not just for water and shoreline, but for justice for my daughter, for the memory of my cabin. But before I could commit, I needed to verify one thing, the supposed emergency that justified Brenda's special assessment: the dredging. Years ago, before Timberline collapsed, I had been hired as a contractor to help install an automated spillway at the far end of the lake. It was a simple, elegant design: a solar panel, a float switch, and a reinforced gate that regulated water levels naturally. It was built to last with almost no maintenance, a system I was proud of. If Brenda claimed the water levels were dangerously low, I knew where to check. I hiked through brush and tall grass, the smell of damp earth thick in the morning air. Birds scattered as I pushed past branches, and after a half-mile trek there, it was the old spillway standing like a forgotten sentinel. I brushed away leaves and checked the panel. The battery still trickled charge. The float switch rose and fell with the gentle lapping of the lake. Everything was intact. The water level was perfect. No dredging had ever been needed. The $75,000 was nothing more than Brenda's personal slush fund. I pulled out my phone and began filming. I explained the system in simple terms, showed the working parts, and panned to the waterline. I knew homeowners would understand the HOA had billed them for emergency repairs on a system that was self-sustaining. By the time I walked back to my truck, the plan had solidified in my mind. Step 1. Gather irrefutable evidence: the fake invoice, the plat map, the working spillway. Step 2. Quietly acquire the lake through Miller's legal channels. Step 3. Reveal it all at once, not in the sterile confines of a boardroom, but in the public eye, where Brenda couldn't spin or silence the truth. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about exposing the fraud that had turned my neighbors into hostages. And if that meant betting everything I had, so be it. That evening, Maya came over for dinner. She saw the blueprints, the deeds, the invoices spread across the kitchen table. Her eyes narrowed. "Dad," she said softly, "what are you doing?" "I'm ending this," I said. "I found the key. The lake isn't theirs. It never was. I'm going to take it back." Her voice trembled. "With what? Your retirement, your savings, you're risking everything for what?" "A body of water." I shook my head. "Not just water. It's about the truth. About making sure she can't do this to anyone else." She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "Or is it about revenge?" Her words stung because they weren't entirely wrong. But as I stared out the window at the dark silhouette of Ironwood Lake, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Brenda thought she had erased me when she demolished my cabin. She was wrong. She had only given me the battlefield. And I was ready to fight for it. When you decide to fight a war, you'd better be armed with more than anger. Brenda was cunning, but she was sloppy, too arrogant to imagine someone like me would trace her fraud back to the roots. With Miller drafting the legal petition to acquire Parcel B, I knew the battle would soon shift from paper trails to public perception. But first, I needed to secure the most critical evidence, proving the HOA's so-called emergency dredging was a lie. That's why I went back to the spillway, not just with my phone, but with proper equipment. I lugged a portable water level gauge, an old multimeter, and even a GoPro strapped to my chest. The air smelled sharp, with pine resin, the forest still dripping from last night's rain. I knelt by the structure I had helped install decades ago and ran my hands across the steel frame. It was weathered but intact, the kind of engineering that outlasts bureaucrats. I filmed every detail. The solar panel still carried a charge, powering the float switch that opened and closed the gate depending on rainfall. I demonstrated how the mechanism worked, lifting the float gently and watching the gate shift. The water flowed exactly as it was designed to. No sludge buildup, no emergency, nothing remotely warranting a $75,000 intervention. Then, as if fate itself was backing me up, I discovered a brass plate bolted to the side of the spillway. I'd forgotten it was even there. The plate read, "Installed 1986, Timberline Development, designed for perpetual flow regulation." I recorded it all, narrating in plain language, careful to sound more like a neighbor explaining than an angry man ranting. People wouldn't trust fury, they'd trust facts. With video evidence secured, I felt the ground tilt in my favor. Still, Brenda wasn't resting. Every week, another violation notice arrived in my mailbox. Oil stain in driveway, $100 fine. Unapproved lawn ornament, $50 fine. One notice even claimed my porch light was too bright, supposedly disrupting community aesthetics. It was harassment dressed up in bylaw language, and the fines stacked like poker chips meant to bluff me into folding. Worse, the social pressure mounted. The HOA newsletter's Good Neighbor Policy column singled me out again. Certain residents are attempting to undermine the integrity of our community with baseless accusations. We remind all members that such divisive rhetoric harms property values and community spirit. My neighbors looked at me differently in the grocery line, eyes sliding away, whispers trailing behind me. Fear had metastasized into suspicion, but the deeper they pushed me into exile, the sharper my focus grew. Late one night, Tom came over his boots, still muddy from his ranch. He slapped a six-pack on my kitchen table and sat across from me, grinning. "You've got her in a corner," he said, "but don't think she won't claw her way out. Brenda doesn't just want power, she feeds on it. You're taking away her meal." I showed him the spillway footage, the fraudulent invoice, the plat map. His eyes lit up with the same fire I'd seen in him back in uniform. "This isn't just a defense," he said. "This is an ambush. You're going to hit her with 3 angles at once: financial fraud, lack of ownership, and technical proof. No way she survives it." I wanted to believe that, but doubt gnawed at me. The community didn't want truth. They wanted peace, even if it was the kind enforced by Brenda's clipboard. Exposing her fraud would only matter if I had the legal leverage to make it stick. That's where Miller came in. Weeks passed like years. Miller filed the petition quietly, each motion buried in legalese. I signed documents until my hand cramped every page, eating away at the nest egg my wife and I had built for retirement. At night, I'd stare at the ceiling while the weight of it pressed down. My wife tried to reassure me, though I could see the worry carving new lines into her face. Then one crisp morning, Miller called. His voice was calm, almost casual, but the words hit me like a hammer. "The state has given preliminary approval. Parcel B is moving into your possession pending final sign-off. Congratulations, Mr. Cole, you're about to own Ironwood Lake." For the first time since the bulldozer flattened my cabin, I felt something warm break through the ice inside me. Hope. But the victory wasn't secure yet. Brenda had resources, allies, and a talent for spinning lies into truth if given a microphone. I needed to control the narrative before she caught even a whiff of what was happening. So I planned. Step 1. Finalize the deed quietly, ensuring the HOA couldn't contest ownership before it was recorded. Step 2. Prepare my presentation, invoice, spillway, footage, deed, all tied together in a narrative even the most fearful neighbor couldn't ignore. Step 3. Deliver it not in the sterile environment of an HOA board meeting where Brenda controlled the agenda, but in front of the community itself, live undeniable, unspinnable. The timing had to be perfect. As I refined my plan, the harassment escalated. Paula Brenda's shadow began showing up, unannounced, clipboard in hand. One afternoon, she paced off the distance from my driveway to the street and claimed my truck was parked 6 inches over the line. Another time, she photographed my daughter's car when she came to visit, claiming it was unauthorized guest parking. It was all designed to rattle me. Instead, it steeled me. Every petty fine, every thinly veiled attack in the newsletter, every suspicious glance from a neighbor, it was fuel. Proof that Brenda's empire wasn't built on community, it was built on fear. And fear only lasts until someone stands up. Late one evening, as I reviewed the spillway footage on my laptop, Maya called. Her voice was tight. "Dad, I drove by the lot today," she said. "They're showing it to a family. Kids were running in the dirt where our cabin stood. Brenda's trying to resell it." The words twisted like a knife. To her, the cabin wasn't just wood and nails. It was where she healed, where she found her strength again. And now Brenda wanted to erase even the memory by flipping the land like a used car. "I'm going to stop her," I said, my voice steady. "By bankrupting yourself," she snapped. "This obsession, it's changing you." Her words stung, but they didn't shake my resolve. Because deep down I knew the truth. This wasn't just about me. It was about every neighbor who had swallowed their anger out of fear. About proving that tyrants like Brenda don't get to write the last chapter. By the time I hung up, the plan was no longer just an idea. It was a mission. The final piece of the ambush was in place, and when the moment came, Brenda would never see it coming. The weeks between preliminary approval and the final sign-off felt like an eternity stretched thin. Every day was a test of patience, a negotiation between hope and fear. Miller told me to breathe, to trust the process. But trust is a fragile currency when you've already watched a machine of power flatten the things you love. I kept returning to the same thought: the deed would be a cold slab of paper, but the moment it went on file, it would be a surgical strike, legal, irreversible, and public. Brenda's kingdom depended on ambiguity. A recorded deed would be a bright light that showed the skeletons. But the process almost broke me before it ever finished. The cost was brutal. Miller's fees were mercilessly practical: every hour, every filing, every registry check. Then came the closing costs, and the quiet, humiliating moments of signing over retirement savings I'd imagined would carry me and my wife through calm days and quiet trips. I watched numbers fall from our nest egg in neat columns and felt pieces of my future being packed into envelopes and notarized. Maya watched the spreadsheet once, and her face closed like a shutter. "Dad," she said, "you don't have to do this alone. There are other ways." But the other ways were soft consolations that wouldn't put the truth on paper. Brenda seemed to smell the change in the wind. Her harassment turned personal and petty in ways that were almost comically vindictive. Someone slashed the tire on my truck and left a note that read, "Next time we'll block your driveway." Paula started photographing my property, as if cataloging crimes: close-ups of my mailbox, angles of my trash cans, the exact spot my neighbor's yard light flickered. Once a plastic flamingo appeared in my yard, pinned with a little printed flyer: "Good neighbors keep community standards." She'd smile when she walked by, as if the tiny plastic bird proved some higher moral law. Miller pragmatic and relentless worked two fronts: keep the paperwork moving and anticipate any last-minute ambushes from Brenda. She tried one. A week before the expected recordation, she filed a motion claiming continuing adverse possession and demanded an injunction to prevent transfer until the court could evaluate alleged historical community use. It was a last-ditch smoke grenade meant to scare off buyers and scare me into folding. Miller laughed the kind of laugh that is equal parts fury and contempt. He filed an emergency opposition, pointed to the county records, to the chain of title that had been dormant for decades, and to the clear language of property law. The judge set a hearing date, but Miller had already reserved the recording slot with the county clerk and gave me a timetable that left Brenda scrambling. On the morning the deed would be recorded, I felt like a man walking across a frozen river with each step cracking ice behind me. Tom came by before dawn with 2 thermoses of coffee and an old toolbox. He clapped my shoulder like we were still young and reckless in foreign sand. "You ready to own a damn lake?" he said, grinning. I wanted to laugh with him, wanted the sound to be a release valve, but the sound came out thinner, wet with nerves. We drove to the county office in silence. The place smelled like toner and old registries. The clerk, a woman with a chain of keys around her waist, took the documents and ran them through the machine. For a moment, time-stilled phones paused, a pen hung midair, and then the stamp came down, recorded. The paper slid back across the counter, and Miller folded his hands the way he folded a case file. "Parcel B is now in the name of Ethan Cole Holdings, LLC, he said softly, but the words felt thunderous. I remember holding the copy of the recorded deed in my hands and feeling the world tilt. It was absurdly heavier than I expected, the ink thick, the county seal embossed like a small coin. For a breathless second, I thought of my father of the porch, railing with his initials splintered in 2. This was for him, for my wife, for Maya, for every photograph in the dirt. It was about setting right what had been wronged, but the victory was not a clean break. Brenda responded with fury, not with law at first, but with performance. She went on the community live stream, her voice a carefully tuned mixture of outrage and wounded virtue. "This is theft by a single homeowner," she declared, the same tone she'd used when justifying the demolition. "He bought a title in secret and now denies the rest of the community access to their lake." Loyalists rallied. Volunteers who'd once accepted Brenda's favors now painted themselves as defenders of shared values. Comments scrolled with anger. A few neighbors messaged me with threats thinly disguised as righteous concern. Legal maneuvers followed. Brenda's lawyer filed an appeal that argued notice failures in the abandoned property process, a technicality the bar can always use to press pause. Miller countered with a mountain of evidence we'd already assembled: county records, chain of title history, sworn affidavits about the inactive holding, and the clear absence of any recorded HOA claim for Parcel B. He asked for expedited relief. The judge, after a private review, refused the injunction and allowed our recorded deed to stand while the appeal moved slowly through the system. In the end, the law moved faster than Brenda's theatrics. That same week, I began preparing the physical reality of ownership. I ordered professionally printed signs, bold red letters, legal language warnings about trespass. I rented heavy-duty chain and a lock rated for security fences. I hired a small crewman I'd known from the marina and a retired carpenter who remembered me as the quiet electrician who always fixed things right. We drove out under the cover of gray morning to the boat launch nobody had claimed and hammered posts into the ground, wrapped the chain around the gate, and bolted the first sign. When the first padlock clicked, I felt a tangible change like a hinge closing on an old lie. At home, the cost of the fight had begun to show. My wife, who had never liked the spotlight, met me on the porch the day after the deed posted and took my hand. Her eyes were fierce but tired. "You could have just paid for a rebuild," she said. "We could have survived." I squeezed her fingers. "Maybe," I said, "but this was never just timber. It was a message. If Brenda gets away with this, she'll do it again." She nodded, the line between pride and worry clear on her face. Maya came over less and texted more. Her messages were a mix of fierce support and exhaustion. "Don't let this make you a monster," she wrote one night. "Promise me you'll stop when this is done." The truth was, I didn't know where the line was. I only knew that the deed in my hands meant I could now control the narrative instead of hoping others would. Neighbors began to shift slowly. A few who had been silent before came by to say small, awkward apologies. The retired teacher with her hands wrapped in wool, the couple who'd once accepted a variance but felt guilt now. Mr. Dugan brought over a thermos and a grin like an olive branch. "You did good, son," he said, and I believed him. Even with the deed recorded and the gate locked, nothing felt finished. There were court dates waiting, shrill online posts, and the small, simmering resentments of a community rearranging itself around a new reality. But for the first time since the bulldozer, I slept with something other than cold fury, a tenuous, trembling hope. The next move I knew would be public and decisive. If I was going to end this, I'd have to do it where no amount of smoke or spin could hide the truth, the lakefront, in front of everyone who had watched, applauded, or looked away. Owning the lake on paper was one thing. Making the community accept that reality was another. Brenda had thrived for years by crafting an image of control, the HOA as guardian, herself as steward. The deed shattered that illusion, but paper alone wouldn't topple her throne. People needed to see it, feel it, and understand what had been hidden under their noses. That's why I planned the strike during the HOA's annual summer barbecue. It was their showcase event, the night Brenda bathed in applause with banners fluttering, neighbors sipping cheap wine, kids running under strings of patio lights. She'd give her speech about community values and preserving our investments. It was the perfect stage to burn her script in real time. Tom helped me rig the setup. We hauled a generator, a professional-grade camera, and a tripod down to the lot where my cabin once stood. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had reduced it to rubble, but it was about to become my broadcasting station. The plan was simple: go live on the HOA's own Facebook page, stream directly across the water, while Brenda's audience gathered and unveiled the truth piece by piece. The day of the barbecue, I locked the boat launch with a heavy chain and posted fresh signs: private property, access by permit only, violators will be prosecuted. The bold red letters glared in the sunlight. Already, fishermen and pontoon boat owners were calling Brenda's office in confusion, demanding answers. By evening, the frustration would boil over. As dusk fell, I watched from across the water. The clubhouse was lit up, the smell of hot dogs and charcoal drifting across the lake. Music played from a tinny speaker. Families chatted. Brenda moved through the crowd like royalty, smiling tightly, her wine glass never empty. Paula trailed her clipboard under her arm, jotting notes like a scribe recording history. At exactly 7:30, Tom gave me a nod. The camera's red light blinked on. I stood framed against the lake, the last glow of the sunset at my back, and began, "Good evening, neighbors. For those who don't know me, my name is Ethan Cole. My cabin used to stand on this very spot until your HOA, under Brenda Malloy's direction, demolished it over fees I never owed." Phones buzzed in the crowd across the water, heads bent down, faces illuminated by blue screens. Brenda, mid-sentence at her podium, faltered as murmurs rippled through her audience. I held up the first piece of evidence, the Clearwater invoice. "This is the document Brenda used to justify a $75,000 emergency dredging assessment. Look closely. The logo is pixelated. There's no business license, no tax ID. And the signature, it's Brenda's own hand forged on a fake company." Gasps traveled like wind across the patio. I dropped the paper and played the spillway footage. On their phones, neighbors watched me kneeling beside the decades-old system, explaining in clear, simple terms how the solar float switch regulated the lake automatically. No dredging was needed. There never was an emergency. This was theft, plain and simple. Brenda's smile cracked. Her wine glass shook in her hand. Then came the killing blow. I held up the deed, its county seal, glinting in the camera's light. And here, I said, is the recorded truth. As of 3 weeks ago, Ironwood Lake is no longer in limbo. It belongs to me. This HOA has spent years pretending to manage land it never owned. Starting tonight, that lie ends. Effective immediately, all HOA access to the docks, the boat launch, and the lake is revoked. Any board member caught trespassing will answer to the law. Chaos erupted at the clubhouse. People shouted, some at Brenda, some at me, some at the sky, as though it could explain how their queen had lied for years. Paula waved her clipboard like a sword, yelling for order. Brenda's face turned pale, then red, then pale again. She stormed down the clubhouse steps, heels clacking, phone pressed to her ear. I kept the camera steady. Brenda, if you're calling the sheriff, you should know I've already filed this deed with his office. Your papers forgeries, your invoices lies, your authority gone. She reached me breathless, thrusting a stack of covenants in my face. These prove control of the lake was transferred years ago, she shrieked live for everyone to see. Do they? I asked, my voice calm. Or did you just print them this afternoon like your dredging invoice? Her hand froze. Her bluff collapsed under the weight of silence. Behind her, neighbors, who once cowered, began shouting. Mr. Dugan, trembling with fury, marched up and jabbed a finger at her chest. You stole from us, Brenda. You lied to every single one of us. The crowd turned. Loyalists shrank back. The queen had no kingdom left. She screamed incoherent about lies, lawsuits, conspiracies, but it didn't matter. The live stream had shown everything. The paper trail, the fraud, the deed. She wasn't fighting me anymore, she was fighting the truth, and the truth was winning. Later that night, deputies arrived. I didn't even need to speak. They had the deed on file, my evidence archived, and Brenda's tantrum on camera. She was cited for trespassing and warned about potential forgery charges. Watching her shoved into the back of a patrol car wasn't the end, but it was the beginning of the collapse. When I finally turned off the camera, Tom slapped my back, grinning ear to ear. That, he said, was the cleanest ambush I've ever seen. I stared across the water at the clubhouse, where lights flickered and voices argued deep into the night. Brenda's empire had cracked wide open. The war wasn't over, but the decisive battle had been fought in public, and I hadn't just survived it, I'd won it. Still, as I packed the equipment into my truck, one thought lingered: victory is never the last chapter. Brenda was too proud, too consumed by power to accept defeat quietly. There would be one more move, and I had to be ready. If Brenda's public humiliation at the barbecue was the earthquake, what came after was the aftershock, and sometimes those do more damage than the quake itself. The night she was cited by deputies, neighbors thought it was over. They thought the queen had fallen, that the war had ended. But power doesn't dissolve quietly, not when it's been someone's oxygen. For Brenda, losing control of Ironwood Lake was an extinction-level event. For 2 days, she disappeared. Her house stayed dark, blinds pulled tight. Paula was seen skulking around, but even she looked rattled, avoiding eye contact when people asked questions. Rumors flew Brenda had fled the county. Brenda was lawyering up. Brenda was sick. I didn't believe any of them. People like her don't retreat, they regroup. The answer came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. My phone buzzed me awake. An old neighbor panicked, whispering, "Ethan, you better get down here. Someone's at the boat launch." I threw on boots and drove the half-mile to the water. Headlights bounced over gravel, and when I pulled up there, she was Brenda Hare, wild, muttering to herself, bolt cutters biting into the heavy chain I had wrapped around the gate. Sparks danced as steel scraped steel. Spray paint dripped down one of my bright red private property signs, the word "mine" scrawled in sloppy letters. I didn't shout. I didn't even step closer. I simply called the sheriff. The deputy arrived within minutes, a young man who looked too tired for drama at that hour. Brenda tried everything, waving forged covenants, shrieking about illegal seizures, even pointing at me like I was the criminal. The deputy listened stone-faced before asking to see her papers. He flipped through them, then walked back to his cruiser and radioed dispatch. When he returned, he carried the recorded deed, the one already filed in his system. "Ma'am," he said flatly, "these papers you have appear to be forgeries. This man's deed is legitimate. You're on his property and damaging his lock. You need to come with me." The sound of handcuffs clicking shut was quieter than I expected, but it rang louder than any speech. Brenda Malloy, the woman who once strutted with a clipboard like it was a royal scepter, was led away in the back of a sheriff's car, charged with trespassing, vandalism, and document forgery. News spread like wildfire the next morning. For years, people had tolerated her because they feared the fines, the retaliation, the social exile. Now they saw her in mugshots, her smirk replaced by a stunned, pale face. The The spell was broken. By noon, the entire HOA board, including Paula, had resigned in a curt two-sentence email. Effective immediately, the undersigned hereby step down from their roles. We wish the community well. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of rats leaping off a sinking ship, but a vacuum of power is still a vacuum and chaos threatens to fill it. For a few uneasy days, Ironwood Lake was leaderless. Neighbors bickered in driveways. Some argued the HOA should be dissolved entirely. Others feared total collapse without bylaws. Property values insurance maintenance people realized how much had been tied to a board they had despised but relied on. That's when Tom stepped up. He'd always been a soldier at heart, but this time he was a community organizer. He convened an emergency meeting not in the suffocating walls of the clubhouse but in my front yard. Folding chairs, thermoses of coffee, people bundled in sweatshirts against the evening chill. For the first time, the air didn't hum with fear. It hummed with possibility. "We can't rebuild the HOA as it was," Tom said, his voice steady. "It was never about community, it was about control. If we rebuild, it has to be transparent, accountable, and temporary until we find something better." For the first time, neighbors spoke freely. A retired teacher suggested term limits. A young couple proposed publishing finances online. Even Mr. Dugan, voice shaking, said, "We need an auditor to dig through Brenda's mess." Heads nodded. Voices rose. Ideas flew. When it was my turn, I stood holding the deed to the lake. "This lake doesn't belong to me alone," I said. "It belongs to all of us." I didn't put everything on the line to be the new tyrant. "I'll lease the lake to the community for $1 a year. 2 conditions: every decision about it must be voted on by all members and we rename it. Not Ironwood Lake, not HOA Lake. From now on, it's Maya's Lake." There was a pause, then applause, hesitant at first, then building. Maya, who had stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, squeezed my hand, tears shining in her eyes. Rebuilding began the next morning. Neighbors who had once avoided me showed up with tool belts and nail guns. Mr. Dugan, who had spent decades as a carpenter, practically took charge of framing the new cabin. Families brought coolers of lemonade and sandwiches. Laughter rose where silence had once suffocated. It wasn't just construction, it was penance. It was healing. Each hammer strike buried the memory of fear. Each wall raised was a declaration never again. By summer's end, my cabin stood tall again, not just by my hands, but by dozens of others. Beneath its foundation, we buried remnants of the old cabin, charred wood, a broken mug, a photograph frame cracked in the demolition. A time capsule of loss and resurrection. The story of Ironwood Lake didn't end with a bulldozer or a deed. It ended with a fishing line cast into calm water, children laughing along the shore, and neighbors who finally learned the difference between rules and community. Brenda thought she had erased me. In truth, she erased herself. And as the sun set over Maya's Lake during our first community fishing day, I finally breathed without anger in my chest. Justice wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about restoration. And we had restored more than a cabin. We had restored each other. By the time autumn leaves began to flame red around Maya's Lake, the story of what had happened here had become a kind of local legend. Neighbors spoke of it in the grocery store, at the diner, even in the quiet whispers exchanged at church pews, how the HOA that once ruled with fines and fear had been toppled, how a single homeowner turned the tide by outmaneuvering the very system meant to crush him. But legends can be fragile. Communities, like people, need structure or they collapse under uncertainty. That was the final test, turning victory into stability. Tom and the interim committee convened open meetings weekly, this time under a canvas tent set up by the water. No podium, no banners, no pretense of authority. Just folding chairs and a long table where anyone could speak. Transparency became the new order of business. We voted on every major decision, open ballots, not whispered hands. One of the first votes was to hire an independent auditor. When the results of Brenda's creative bookkeeping came back, the crowd gasped. Tens of thousands spent on phantom contracts, double-billed landscaping, even emergency snow removal charges filed during years when no snow had fallen within 100 miles. Neighbors who had once defended her were left pale and speechless. That's when we created the restitution fund. The first payout went not to me, but to families who had been crushed under fraudulent special assessments. One widow broke down crying when the committee handed her a check large enough to cover months of overdue mortgage payments. "I thought I was going to lose my house," she whispered. "She nearly destroyed me." For the first time, healing spread like a ripple instead of fear. Rebuilding my cabin became symbolic of more than personal justice. It was a community act of contrition. On the first day of construction, I expected maybe 2 or 3 volunteers. Instead, dozens came neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years, people who once pulled their curtains when I passed. They carried tool belts, lumber, even casseroles for lunch breaks. Mr. Dugan took to barking orders like a foreman, reminding everyone that I might own the deed, but we all shared the responsibility for what came next. Every swing of the hammer carried weight. Not just the weight of nails sinking into fresh wood, but of guilt, redemption, and solidarity. Children ran along the shore, while adults worked their laughter unburdened by HOA rules about quiet hours or restricted shoreline access. One evening, as the frame of the new cabin rose against the fading sunset, Maya stood beside me, her hand tucked into mine. Her eyes shimmered, but this time it wasn't grief, it was pride. "You were right," she said quietly. "It was never just about land, it was about us." I squeezed her hand, and for the first time in months, the cold knot inside me finally unraveled. The final step was deciding the lake's future. I knew I could never be the kind of man who turned victory into another tyranny. At the closing meeting before winter, I stood before the community with the deed in my hands. "This paper may carry my name," I said, "but this water belongs to all of us. I will lease it to the new HOA for $1 a year. 2 conditions: every decision must be voted on by the entire community, and this lake carries a new name. From today, it is Maya's Lake." The vote was unanimous. For the first time, our community cheered not because they were told to, but because they believed in something larger than themselves. By spring, the new cabin stood strong cedar walls, gleaming a porch that stretched wide, a foundation that held not only wood, but the buried relics of what had come before. Underneath, we laid a time capsule of broken beams, old photographs, and signed notes from neighbors who pledged never to let tyranny return. The first community fishing day at Maya's Lake drew more people than any HOA barbecue ever had. Families cast lines into calm waters, children splashed at the shoreline, and laughter rose where fear once hung heavy. I sat on the porch, Maya beside me, watching the sun blaze gold across the lake. For the first time in years, I felt peace, not the peace of silence, but of belonging. Brenda's name faded quickly. She moved out of the county while awaiting trial. Her empire dismantled her reputation ash. People stopped speaking of her with fear, and began speaking of her as a cautionary tale. The woman who thought she owned everything had lost it all. But for us, the story wasn't about Brenda anymore. It was about resilience, about the power of truth sharpened by patience. We had lost a cabin, but in its ashes, we built a community stronger than ever. And when I cast my line into Maya's Lake that evening, hearing children's laughter echo across the water, I finally understood justice isn't just about punishment. It's about restoration. And no bulldozer, no forged invoice, no tyrant with a clipboard could ever take that away. In life, there will always be Brenda's people who cling to power through fear, who twist rules into weapons, who believe they can erase others to keep control. But what this story taught me is simple: fear only rules until someone dares to break it. When truth is armed with persistence and community finds its voice, even the most arrogant tyrant crumbles. So I'll ask you, have you faced your own Brenda, someone who thought they had all the power? Drop your story in the comments. And if you believe no one should suffer under abuse dressed up as rules, hit subscribe. Join us, because together we'll keep shining a light where fear used to live.